So here's what I want you guys to do next. So get your notebook out again. And what we're going to do is we're going to like draw a line straight across that notebook. And we're going to kind of divide it into sections, and I'll talk about what they're going to be labeled. So this line represents is anything on top of this line is times when the government is expanding. So expansion of government. On the bottom part of the line, I want you to write government is taking less of a role in the lives of its people. So hopefully this is a little clearer here. Let me zoom in onto that. There we go. It's a little bit better. Okay. So we're kind of highlighting this idea of expansion of government. Now, the time periods we're going to talk about, we're going to walk through this entire era, but the time periods that we're going to talk about are first I'm going to talk about 1777 to 1787. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about 1787 to 1789, very short period. Then I'm going to talk about 1790 to 1860. And then I'm going to talk about 1861 to 1877, and then I'll finish the second half after. So what I want you to do is just kind of make this timeline in your notes. And we're going to walk through it together. Okay, so in different eras, what you have to understand is that throughout different eras, sometimes our government is getting smaller, sometimes our government is increasing. You need to distinguish when each is happening. So in what eras is our government getting bigger, and in what eras is our government getting smaller? Okay, so I'm going to kind of walk you through this process for our entire periods that are on our test, periods 3 through 7. Okay, so I'm going to begin at the very beginning, and I start with 1777 to 1787 because this is sometimes referred to as the critical period. And it's called the critical period because it's that time in between the end of the American Revolution, or the American Revolution is being fought all the way through the creation of our Constitution. And what you have to understand is that as far as our government is concerned, in this era from 1777 to 1787, the defining government, the Constitution that ran the United States, was known as the Articles of Confederation. Okay, so the Articles of Confederation represents a decrease in the size of government. You know, we were coming from a government that was more powerful under Great Britain, and here we have a government that is incredibly weak. Okay, so how weak was the Articles of Confederation? Well, the following things: they couldn't tax. You should know that. They had no power to tax. They had no army. There was no navy. They had no power to regulate trade. There was no executive branch. We could keep going. There was no executive branch. There was no there was no judicial branch. They couldn't stop disputes between states. They pretty much could not do anything. And so in this first system of government, we've got a government that is backing away from responsibilities, putting more responsibilities on individual people and individual states. So the first government has almost no power. That does not work out very well. And so there is a number of crises. Obviously, states start racking up debts. America's financial system is in ruin. You got Shays' Rebellion all happening during this time period. And so the reaction in 1787 is for America to do something about this. And so it's in this time period that we see between 1787 and 1789, the creation of the Constitution. Now, the Constitution represents a major change from this time period because it is an era in which all of a sudden now the government has an executive branch. There's a president. There's a judicial branch. They have the power to tax. They have the power to regulate trade. The amount of powers that are given to this new government are significant compared to the old system. And so we see that as an expansion of power over here. Okay. Now that takes us to our next time period. Now we know that the government has gotten more powerful between 1787 and 1789, but exactly how powerful it should be is really up for debate. And really, one of the biggest constitutional arguments that happens between 1790 and 1860 is this question of, okay, how powerful should the central government be versus the state government? And in this time period, it's an era in which there's a lot of like push and pull, back and forth. And these obviously different groups of people, different political parties that are fighting for either more power to the central government or more powers to the states. So you notice I don't have an arrow on one side or an arrow on the other side, because really throughout this entire period, 1790 to 1860, there's this kind of pull back and forth between like different political parties over how strong the government should be. So to give you an idea of what represents each of these sides, on one side you've got, for example, the side that wants more powerful central government would be people like Hamilton, and we see him with his Hamilton's financial plan. Wants more powerful government, and wants a looser interpretation of the Constitution. You've got the, like later on in that second era of political parties that we talked about, you've got Henry Clay. And Henry Clay is advocating for the American system. He wants a new national bank, and he wants internal improvements. He's arguing that the government should play a more larger role in creating tariffs. So all this is represented on this side, and the Whigs in general also represented a stronger central government, which we talked about. Now on the other side of this, you've got this issue of Jefferson, who's arguing for more power to the states. He opposed Hamilton's financial plan. He's the same person who wrote the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, arguing a compact theory that says that states can nullify laws if they want. You've got the Democratic Republicans supporting that concept. You've got later Andrew Jackson, who's suspicious of the federal government, along with John C. Calhoun, who's going to argue for nullification. And the Democrats in general, they're all supportive of states' rights. So really when we're talking about this era, it's this idea of, central power versus states' rights. Okay? And really, the thing that finally solves this issue is the Civil War. The Civil War determines whether or not the compact theory and whether states have the right to secede, whether they have the right to nullify laws, and as it turns out, they don't. The federal government is more powerful than the states. And that's one of the things that comes out of the Civil War. And then, so in the era after the Civil War, we've got a massive expansion of the size of government. So how is the government expanding in the Civil War and its aftermath? So as I said, the Civil War answers that question of who's more powerful. And it determines this idea that the federal government is more powerful than states. Okay, but there's some other things that like shows the new strength of the central government. There are actions taken by Lincoln. He's a really strong president. So, like for example, when Lincoln suspends the writ of habeas corpus, that shows the power of the central government. It's a W. Writ of habeas corpus. Okay, the Emancipation Proclamation shows the growing power of the federal government to, in this case, declare an end to slavery. In addition to that, there's just the mobilization for the war. So as part of the mobilization for the war, there's a draft. That draft obviously represents a growing power of the central government. And then there's also Reconstruction itself. So Reconstruction is also something that demonstrates this massive increase in the power of the federal government. So out of Reconstruction comes like the Reconstruction Act of 1867. In which basically the federal government of the North treat the South as if they're conquered territories, organize them into essentially military districts and put them under the command of the military. You also have a massive expansion of the rights of African Americans by the federal government. The federal government becomes the protector of rights in American society. So we see like the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment all coming from the federal government. Okay, and so between the Civil War and Reconstruction, we have this massive expansion of the power of the federal government. All right, let's finish this up and then we'll move on to our questions. Okay, so we've got just a few more eras to talk about and then we're almost done. So let's extend our timeline to another page and let's divide it up. The eras that we're going to be talking about here are 1877, so the end of the Reconstruction, to 1890. Which is the start of the Progressive Era, 1890 to 1920, the Roaring Twenties, and then 1932 to 1945, the start of the New Deal all the way through the end of World War II. And just like in the last sheet, the top line is going to represent a time when government is expanding. The bottom line is going to represent a time when government is taking less of a role in the lives of its people. So let's just walk through how is government increasing or shrinking in these eras. All right, so I'm going to start with 1877. So in general, like between 1877 and 1890, we see government getting smaller. Now, how is that happening? The first thing you need to know is the New South. So by 1877, Reconstruction ends, and it ends for the most part in failure. The North pulls out of the South and allows the Redeemers in the South, who are Southern Democrats, to come back to power. And what they begin to do is strip away a lot of the rights that had been established during Reconstruction. So if you remember right, they established poll taxes, they established literacy tests for African Americans, the Ku Klux Klan emerges, and what they try to do is they try to strip away, as I said, a lot of the gains that African Americans had achieved. Eventually, by the end of this era, segregation is coming into play. Okay, so the New South represents the power of the federal government shrinking, especially in this case in the South. We also start to see, and I'll actually just make a note here, and you should probably make a note that when we talk about this, we're talking about the Redeemers here. A second thing that you need to know is that in the North, there's also kind of a shrinking of government as well. As the federal government that was so powerful in Reconstruction takes a back seat to business. And we see an era of laissez-faire government. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that the government is taking a back seat to to business during this time period. If you guys remember right, we didn't really talk a lot about the presidents during this era. And the reason we don't really talk a lot about the presidents during this time period is that the presidents aren't the leading figures in society. Sure, I mean, you might know Grover Cleveland. You might know him. You might know all about the accomplishments of Ulysses S. Grant. But the reality is that the more notable figures during this time period are Rockefeller, Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, and so on. Laissez-faire means that the government really is they're helping business, but they're not really regulating business. They're allowing business to kind of drive what's happening in the United States. Now, this continues all the way to 1890. And from 1890 to 1920, we have a new era in which we see a backlash to laissez-faire, and we start to see a growing increase in the size of government. And this era is dominated by what we refer to as the progressive era. Now, before we get to the progressive era, we should first understand the populists, because the populists set the stage for the progressive era. The populists were farmers who wanted to gain more regulations on big businesses, especially the railroads. They wanted a government to have more of they wanted the people to have more direct say over government. They wanted the government to regulate business to a higher degree. They lost. The populists ended up being defeated in the election of 1896. But their ideas carry on into the progressive era. And the progressives kind of take up the ideas of the populists. Now, to remember, what is the difference between the two? Populists are going to be mainly farmers. They're going to be people and they're going to be rural Americans who want to see these changes. Progressives tend to be middle-class urbanites. And under the progressives, we see the Square Deal under Teddy Roosevelt, which is his 3 C's: conservation, consumer protection, control of corporations. So those are his 3 C's, and that's the Square Deal. We've got consumer protections in the form of the establishment of the FDA. You've got the breaking up of monopolies with the Sherman Antitrust Act. Okay, all of this is happening in this time period. Now, it's not just the progressives, though, that are expanding the role of government. I'm going to keep going here. World War I also expands the role of government. So the mobilization of the United States for World War I, which begins in, really America enters by 1917, also is going to expand the role of government. And as part of that mobilization, there's a draft. On top of that, you got on the home front, the federal government that's encouraging people to grow victory gardens and to conserve energy with the establishment of a daylight savings time. And then also you've got powerful laws like the Espionage Act and the Sedition Acts, which limited the rights of people. So all this is an expansion of government. Okay, now this time period is followed up by a contraction of government, and the contraction is in the form of the Roaring Twenties. So if you remember right, the Roaring Twenties is a return to laissez-faire politics, and it is the government taking a back seat, and instead culture that is driving what's happening in America. That is going to change again in 1932. I'm trying to speed this up because we don't have forever. And in 1932, there is a massive increase in the size of government in the form of the New Deal and later World War II. So let's go through that together. So how is government expanding after 1932? So the Roaring Twenties, it was smaller, there was laissez-faire, then the Depression hits, and that kind of causes an increase in the size of government. So what does that look like? It looks like first the New Deal. The New Deal is a massive expansion of government under FDR. We've got all these different programs that we've talked about, the SEC. the FDIC, the WPA, the AAA. Okay, all these are in your book. Maybe most importantly, Social Security. Okay, so that's all happening as a result of the New Deal. The New Deal is, having the government do things that it had never done before. But World War II, which is what actually ends the Depression, also massively expands the size and power of government. So you've got the mobilization. Again, anytime we're mobilizing for war, the government is going to play a larger role. So in this case, there's the first peacetime draft ever. We actually start drafting people before the war even begins. Not to mention the fact that on the home front, everything is converted to the war effort. So for example, Ford Motor Company no longer is producing cars. Instead, they're producing tanks and long-range bombers. So that shift is all done by the government. We've got the government interning the Japanese with Executive Order 9066, which shows an increased power of the government. Not all these increases in power are good. And they're doing a massive building up of technology with the Manhattan Project and the coordination of the development of atomic weapons. And this is just to mention a few things. So World War II and the New Deal is a massive expansion of government. And of course, the government will continue to increase throughout the 20th century until we start to see that conservative movement we just talked about, that is going to be a backlash to that. So here is our second notes for our expansion of government. And hopefully together, that gives you an idea of how our government is getting larger and smaller throughout this entire time period, so that you can hopefully answer some political questions for the day of the AP test. Okay.